In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 7, where last time we went over the aggregate demand curve in the ADAS model. This time we will go over the equilibrium concept in the ADAS model by defining a macroequilibrium, from which we will classify different types of macroequilibrium in the form of a long-run equilibrium and a short-run equilibrium, which will then allow us to conclude for the day with respect to a summary. With all this in mind, beginning with our preliminaries, to explain business cycles, we have been developing the ADAS model, which we also mentioned would be accompanied with the Phillips curve model, where with respect to the ADAS model, it should be able to convey movement from a full employment state to a non-full employment state and vice versa in order to replicate recoveries to a peak as well as contractions to a trough. Additionally, it should be able to replicate the co-movements that we have seen in our annual US data, in that the unemployment rate is countercyclical, the inflation rate is acyclic, and with respect to the unemployment rate and inflation rate, the two are negatively correlated in the short run, but independent in the long run. Now, with all this in mind, with respect to the ADAS model, thus far what we have done is develop its components, where in terms of components, there is the long-run aggregate supply curve, which represents potential real GDP and is vertical due to being independent of the price level. The short-run aggregate supply curve, which represents the ability and willingness for firms in the economy to supply real GDP, and it is upward sloping due to the profit and cost effects. And the aggregate demand curve, which represents consumer, firm, government, and foreign agent willingness and ability to demand real GDP in the economy, and it is downward sloping due to the real balance, interest rate, and foreign trade effects. Now, with all our components in place, we seek to piece them together and define the equilibrium concept in the model. Now, putting all three curves together, we have our ADAS model below, in which the price level is on the vertical axis, quantity of real GDP is on the horizontal axis, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, and vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, where with our model in its entirety, we now have a representation of the aggregate product market of an economy, where with respect to this aggregate product market, equilibrium is going to be referred to as macroequilibrium, in which it will determine the real GDP level and price level in the economy, and it will occur when buying and selling behavior are compatible with one another. That is to say that aggregate demand will equal short-run aggregate supply, where with all this information, to define macroequilibrium then, it is the price level and real GDP level compatible with buying and selling behavior with respect to aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. Or graphically what this means is looking at the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, where in this model we see occurs at the real GDP level Y star and at the price level P star. Now, having defined macroequilibrium in the model, we also know that with respect to an economy, that an economy has the performance goal of full employment, in which it can meet or fall short of full employment. Where recall that full employment is the lowest rate of unemployment compatible with price stability, where the unemployment portion will mean an unemployment rate between 4 to 6%, in which there's zero cyclical unemployment, and price stability refers to an inflation rate of less than 3%. So, given our concept of macroequilibrium and a performance goal of full employment and an economy capable of meeting and falling short of this performance goal, we should distinguish between a macroequilibrium that meets full employment and falls short of it. Therefore, this brings the definitions of a long-run equilibrium and a short-run equilibrium, in which a long-run equilibrium is a macroequilibrium that satisfies full employment, whereas a short-run equilibrium is a macroequilibrium that does not satisfy full employment. So, with these two subclassifications in mind, let us now proceed by graphically distinguishing between these two types of macroequilibrium, in which we will start with a long-run equilibrium. A long-run equilibrium is a macroequilibrium that satisfies full employment, where to satisfy full employment, that means price stability has been met, as well as our unemployment portion of the goal, where with respect to the ADAS model, to represent that the unemployment portion of the goal has been met, the economy will be producing at potential real GDP, given that potential real GDP corresponds to the real GDP level an economy can produce with full utilization of production resources. Well, if production resources are fully utilized, this will also indicate that full employment levels are being used, where with full employment levels being used, then this means that we'll have zero cyclical unemployment and be at that unemployment rate between 4 to 6%. Now, with respect to ensuring that price stability has been met, an economy will be producing or will be targeting some targeted price level, P star, such that at P star, the inflation rate would be less than 3%, such that price stability has been met. So this is how we'll indicate that this portion of the full employment goal has been met. Where with respect to the ADAS model, this means graphically with respect to potential real GDP is not only will be looking at the intersection of aggregate demand with short-run aggregate supply, but we'll be tacking on with the intersection of the long-run aggregate supply curve as well to indicate that real GDP produced will correspond to potential real GDP Y star, and at the intersection of these three curves, it will be at the targeted price level P star to indicate that price stability has been met as well. Where in terms of business cycles, what this long-run equilibrium means, turning to our graphic below in which real GDP is on the vertical axis and time is on the horizontal axis. And in terms of our run plot, we're looking at real GDP oscillating around potential real GDP, where we see briefly that this contrasts with how we looked at business cycles in our data, in that we looked at the growth rate of real GDP compared to the average growth rate. Here, we're looking at business cycles in an alternative view, as mentioned in that discussion, in which case it's real GDP compared to potential real GDP, in which our classification as well as features will remain the same. It's just how the ADAS model allows us to look at business cycles. But with this in mind, what this means in terms of being at a long-run equilibrium is we will be at an intersection between real GDP. Now moving on to a short-run equilibrium, this is going to be a macro equilibrium in which full employment does not hold, and given that full employment considers unemployment and inflation, there's going to be two different types of short-run equilibria to consider, in which we can further classify in terms of a peak as well as a trough due to either unemployment not being met in terms of its goal for full employment or price stability failing in terms of full employment. With this in mind, we will start with the short-run equilibrium that corresponds to a trough and indicates that there are unemployment concerns in the economy. Now, with respect to this short-run equilibrium, it is going to be the case that the economy is producing below potential real GDP, whereby producing below potential real GDP, this means production resources aren't being fully utilized, in which case we'll assume below full employment levels of labor are being used, where we will see this in our ADAS model, in which we'll have macro equilibrium at the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve, or where in this case we see that we have a real GDP level Y0 and a price level P0, where here the major concern is the real GDP level Y0 is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve, such that if we were to take the difference between Y0 and Y star, the difference would produce a negative number indicating below potential real GDP, where being below potential real GDP indicates an unemployment gap, which is the amount by which real GDP falls short of potential real GDP and lets us know that unemployment exists in the economy, as the gap name suggests. Furthermore, in terms of macro equilibrium condition, graphically this just means looking at the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. And in terms of business cycles, since we're producing below potential real GDP, this will correspond to a low point, or in other words, a trough. We're looking at our business cycle representation. This will correspond to point A, where with respect to our real GDP run plot, we see that point A is a low point that is strictly below potential real GDP, just as we see in our graphical illustration of the ADAS model. Now moving on to our second variant of a short-run equilibrium, in which it is still the case that full employment does not hold. In this variant, we'll be looking at price stability failing, and this will correspond to a peak with respect to business cycles, where to indicate price stability failing, it'll be the case that the macro equilibrium is at a price level above the targeted price level P star, where if we were to take the difference between P star and P0, there would be a positive number, where to look at this, we can see in our ADAS model, macro equilibrium occurs at the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, yielding the real GDP level Y0 and the price level P0, where P0 is above P star, where this is going to be our indication of inflation concerns or price stability failing, where the way that we'll look at this with respect to real GDP to give us this indication is by looking at the real GDP level, where we also see that real GDP is to the right of long-run aggregate supply, in that this economy is producing above potential real GDP. So this inflation concern that exists in the economy is due to this economy overheating in terms of what it's producing, where if we were to take the difference between Y0 and Y star, we'd see that the difference is positive, where this positive amount indicates that there is an inflationary gap, which is the amount by which real GDP exceeds potential real GDP, whereby being above potential real GDP, this is what allows us to see that it's a peak with respect to business cycles, and this is what we'll see to determine if the economy is overheating or not. Where graphically, to look at this type of short-run equilibrium, we only need to look at aggregate demand intersecting short-run aggregate supply, where in terms of business cycles, as mentioned, it's going to correspond to a peak such as point A and B, where these are high points in our real GDP run plot that are strictly above potential real GDP, just as we see in our ADAS model representation. So, having gone through macro equilibrium and distinguished between a long-run equilibrium from a short-run equilibrium, let us now conclude with our summary. Macro equilibrium is the equilibrium concept in the ADAS model that determines the real GDP and price level for an economy, where with respect to macro equilibrium, full employment may hold, which will correspond to a long-run equilibrium, whereas full employment may not hold, which will correspond to a short-run equilibrium, in which if an unemployment gap exists, then this will correspond to a trough with respect to business cycles, whereas if an inflationary gap exists, then this will correspond to a peak with respect to business cycles. With this in mind, where we'll pick up next time is we will start by looking at shocks, where we will begin with supply shocks.